Hello everyone. So in this last video on Parmenides, we'll be discussing what are the doxa fragments, the fragments where he talks about the false way of appearance and the way of seeming and the deceitful way which the goddess said don't go on. But remember, she also gave, so if you remember fragment 1 where she says that it is proper that you should learn all things, both the unshaken heart of the well-rounded truth, you know, this sort of this unshaken heart, this unmoving heart of this well-rounded, well-persuaded truth, and the opinions of mortal, of the brotoi, right? Learn the opinions of mortals as well, in which there is no true conviction, in which there is no true reliance. You cannot be persuaded by that. But nonetheless, she says, you should learn both, right? And how it was, assuredly and truly, and what is confused, and where the aimless eye and the ringing ear sort of ply up and down. The Palindropos Road, remember there's this correct, true road. Remember there was 3 roads, in fact, in the early fragments where we talked about them, where you have the correct, true road of well-persuaded, unshaken, unmoving truth, that is the road of esti, of being, right? Then you have the way which is impossible, from which she bars you, which is the way of non-being, where she says, you don't go down that path, it's impossible, nothing can be said about it anyway. And then you have this third one, which is the Palindropos Road, which is the road that turns back upon itself, which is the road of mortals, of mortal opinions, of the way of seeming and appearances, where things are all confused, where you don't know what's going on, where everything, you know, things are and are not, where you have your senses that deceive you, the eyes that say one thing is and it's not, and your ears give you one report and another. So you have all these different paths. So in the last video, we started with talking about this, the end of fragment 8, where he says, here I end my trustworthy discourse and thought concerning truth. Henceforth, learn the beliefs of mortal men, listening to the deceitful ordering of my words. This is what, the goddess says, listening to the deceitful ordering of my words. And in fact, the words themselves are deceitful, because if you remember that that fragment where she talks about this change of color of it, this was fragment 8. So earlier in this fragment where she says, you know, as many mortal people, they establish things to be true. And what are these things that they establish to be true? They say it is becoming and perishing, to be, being and non-being, to be and not to be, and change of place and exchange of bright color. So all these things, they are established to be true when they're not, right? When they're impossible. And yet they say that these things are. Basically, she, like, when she will talk about these ways, her words themselves will often, she will use words which don't contain any meaning. And in fact, the order of words, because it's all a confused sort of thought, confused ideas, so even the ordering of words is going to be deceitful. You know, so she's basically warning him in advance that, look, this path that I'm going to talk about, it's a deceitful path, don't go down it, but you should still learn of it, because you should learn of the opinions of mortals. Now, why should he learn of the opinions of mortals? You know, this is a pretty good question. So why this deceitful way of seeming at all? So we talked about this in the first video, where we said that it could be because the goddess, in this case, or Parmenides, wants to give a kind of synthesis of the things that people say, you know, the opinions of the brotoi of mortal men, as he says, you know, which things that people say and believe about the world. And he gives a summary of that and then says that, look, this is all deceitful. And in fact, it will be a confused summary, because there is no true conviction that can be found, like in logic, right? In logic, he's just using mathematical ideas. He's not even looking at the world of senses. And he says, logically, it has to be a sphere. Why? Because it cannot be more in one direction and less in another. It's all logical, right? While with the opinion of mortals and with the early, let's say with the Milesians, with Heraclitus, with Xenophanes, with Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans, with all of them, you have different cosmologies, you know, different cosmoi that come up, and different explanations for cosmoi that come up. And so it's all very confusing. So should I believe Thales, that everything is water, or should I believe in Anaximander, that everything is apeiron, or should I believe in Anaximenes, everything is air? Should I believe Heraclitus, that the fire steers all things? Should I believe Xenophanes, that everything is earth and water? Should I believe the Pythagoreans, that, well, I don't know what the Pythagoreans believe in, everything is one, right? That the soul travels from one body to another. Look at the number of different opinions of mortals that are there, and so Parmenides, maybe he's just giving a kind of summary, or maybe we don't have the whole system. So he gives a kind of cosmology, telling in advance that it's all deceitful and not to be trusted. And so maybe he's trying to give, like, from his own perspective, the most sort of complete account that he can come up with of cosmology, while saying at the same time, like Xenophanes says, that as close to the truth as possible, as seeming to be true as possible. But of course, we mortals cannot know the complete truth. It's not for us to know, if you remember that Xenophanes phrase that we discussed. So you have this idea again in Parmenides, perhaps, that it is deceitful, but yet you should learn it, because it can be close to the truth. It might be seeming close to the truth. So a kind of deceitful but likely seeming ordering of the universe. And in this deceitful and likely seeming order, you'll have opposites, you'd have plurality, right? And this is not to be ignored. This is not the kind of world that you can ignore, because we live in a world of appearances. We live in a world where things change. Like he has proved through his poem, like with this theorem, that there is no change, there is no time, there is no motion, there is no space. All these things are not. In fact, being is, and it is motionless and unique and unchanging. But when we look out, we see, the river flowing, air, my hands moving, everything, there is movement. In fact, Zeno will come up with, so if you remember Plato in the beginning that we quoted, Plato's sort of testimonia of a sort, of Parmenides visiting with Zeno. So Zeno is the one presenting his treatise out there, and his treatise is a defense for Parmenides. So he comes up with these paradoxes to show that, there is no motion. So we'll do that next week. But here what we have is this idea of that we live in appearance, so we can come up with a likely sort of explanation of appearance, but we should be aware, as the goddess says, that it is deceitful. Listen to the deceitful ordering of my words. There is deceit in here. And what is the deceit? The deceit is that, things are plural, or, two rather than one. You have the fact that you have night and day, light and darkness, you have hot and cold, that things are and are not, that there is coming to be and perishing. These are the things that are that appear, and he's basically trying to say that these things are deceitful, right? So you have this. In fact, let me just read out a bit more of the poem. So end of fragment 8, so the very last lines, where he says, so lines 53 to 61, where he says, "For they made up their minds to name two forms, of which they must not name so much as one." There need not be two forms, just one form is enough. That is where they have gone astray. That's where mortals have gone astray. And they think of opposites. They distinguish opposite in appearances, and then they assign to them signs different from one another. So they said night and day. And in fact, despite all that opposition to Heraclitus, he says Hesiod was deceived. And people who believe Hesiod are deceived because the day and night is one. And that's exactly what Parmenides is saying out here as well. That, you give them two different names, that there's day and there's night, there's Hemera, and then there is Nyx, right? So Nyx and Hemera are two different things. No, they are not, right? So he says they distinguish them as opposites in appearances and assign to them signs, these words as signs, the sort of signifier, if you're going to use, a very, very anachronistic term of, the Saussurean signifier, where you have like a number of different signifiers which contain opposites, but, and you name one as day, one as night, but they don't signify anything. They signify the same thing. You have different signifiers all signifying the same thing, right? To one, the ethereal flame of fire. So the day is thought of as the ethereal flame of fire, gentle and very light, in every direction identical with itself. That's how people think of as day, but not with the other. And the other two is in itself just the opposite, dark night, dense in appearance and heavy. So then you have the opposite, which is dark, which is dense, which is heavy. And so that is night, And the whole ordering of these, I tell you, says the goddess, as it seems fitting, for so no thought of mortal men shall ever outstrip you. So she says that she's telling him all this, so that he understands the distinction that mortals make between day and night, and they think of one as this ethereal light thing, day. This is really Hesiodic actually, this cosmology, and the other one as being night and dark and heavy and dense. So the difference between this dark mist air and this light aether, so basically they are the same. This is what the goddess is saying. This is one. This is not two, or as Heraclitus would say, day and night are one and the same. So people are deceived, or Hesiod is deceived for Heraclitus. Here, mortal people are deceived in thinking day and night are different. They are one and the same. Then you have. So this is, I think this is the end of this fragment, or is there more? Oh yeah, so as you can see, then again there is this sort of distinction. Then fragment 9, where he continues, he says, but because all things have been named light and night, and things corresponding to their powers have been assigned to this and that, all is full of light and of obscure night at once, both equal, since neither has any share of anything, right? So there is this sort of the confusion of light and darkness, of light and night, and so we think of them as two different things, but at the same time, light is night and night is light. So I suppose he's also criticizing Heraclitus then in this fragment. It just becomes a kind of arbitrary sort of distinction that we are making between the two, while they are one and the same. Yeah. Then we have another fragment. So this is also about light, darkness, night, all kinds of things. He says, this is from Plutarch. So Parmenides has actually made an ordering, and by blending as elements the clear and the dark produces out of them, and by them all sensible appearances. For he has said much about the earth and about the heavens and the sun and the moon. So we don't have all this, right? This is all sort of doxography now, about the doxa fragments. It's doxography about doxa. And he recounts the coming into being of men, and as befits an ancient natural philosopher who put together his own book, not pulling apart somebody else's, he has left none of the important topics undiscussed. Right, now here you have Plutarch saying that no, Parmenides did come up with, a whole cosmology. But as you can see from the poem that exists and that we have, maybe Plutarch missed that one. Basically Parmenides says, but that's all deceitful, right? Don't trust it. Then we have fragment 10, where we have a bit of a cosmology, where he says, and you shall know the nature of aether and all the signs, that is the constellations, all the signs in it, the constellations in it, and the destructive works of the pure torch of the shining sun in it, and whence they came into being. And you shall hear of the wandering works of the round-eyed moon and of her nature, and you shall know too of the surrounding heaven, whence it grew and how necessity, guiding it, fettered it to hold the limits of the stars. So basically what we have here then is that the goddess says that he will learn entire cosmology. He'll know of the stars, he'll know of the constellations, he'll know of the sun, of the moon, basically of plurality. What is a cosmology? Eventually the cosmology is a plurality of the world, of appearances. So he'll know all that. And then you have also fragment 12, where you have the idea of the rings like in an Anaximander. So the narrower rings are filled with unmixed fire, those next to them with night, but into them a share of flame is injected, and in the midst of them is a goddess who steers all things. For she governs the hateful birth and mingling of all things, sending female to mix with male, and again conversely male with female. So the opposites of gender as well, is something that the goddess does. But again, this is deceitful way of appearance. Again, this is a deceitful way of appearance. And then you have another idea of the ring, from Aetius, which is this long sort of explanation of cosmology, of the Milky Way, of the stars, of constellation. And I'm not going to go into any detail about this because it's really not central to what we have, what we understand of Parmenides, because we don't really sit around thinking of Parmenides as cosmology, because as I say, he already sort of, rejects all of it. And other fragments as well, which I'll share with you, where he says, we have one fragment 14, where he says, a night shining foreign light wandering around the earth, this sort of moon, I suppose. Then you have the difference in gender, where he talks about boys and girls, male and female, that, on the right boys, on the left girls, there's one fragment. Where again, this difference of gender is brought forth, the difference of day and light, night and light, of gender, of moon and stars and constellations. I think fragment, we have, I'll sort of end with, in fact, fragment 14, fragment 14, where he says, thus, according to belief, these things came to be and now are, having matured, will come to an end after this in the future. And for them, men have laid down a name to distinguish each one, right? And this really summarizes the problem of the way of appearance for Parmenides, because in the way of truth, you had no becoming, you had no perishing, you had no plurality and divisibility and different names. So this is all a question of doxa, as he says, kata doxan, from according to belief, in accordance with doxa, in accordance with opinions or appearances, or seeming, doxa can be translated as all of these, belief, opinion, seeming, appearance, right? So it's only according to doxa that these things come to be and perish, and you can give names to each one, this naming by mortals of like flash of color, bright light, all these different things, day and night, darkness and light, and boys and girls, male and female, so he says, in fact, if you go back to fragment 4, he says, but look at things which are far off, which are securely present to our mind. You will not cut off being from being. You will not, being clings on to being, remember, right? They're not scattering away and drawing together. So the idea that, appearances, like, or your senses can deceive you, and they can send you into this set of appearances that that spread out and scatter all knowledge. And but in fact, when you go to thought, everything is together in one place, and your thought is what doesn't deceive you. Your thought is what gives you the truth of things, rather than, a deceptive sort of plurality of the world. In fact, I can completely see Descartes reading this while writing his meditations. So you have this idea, and this becomes a very important idea in the history of philosophy, is that you have these two things. You have this realm of truth, which is of mathematical order, perfectly definable. You cannot observe it with your eyes, but you can observe it with your mind. This joke about, I think Diogenes going to Plato and saying, I can see your tables, or I can see your cup, but I cannot see cupness. I cannot see tableness. I can't see the form of the cup or the form of the table. And Plato says, yeah, well, that's because you have eyes, so you can see a cup. That's not very surprising. But you don't have a mind. These are one of the imaginary dialogues, I think, between Plato and Diogenes. You don't have a mind, so of course you cannot see mathematics. To see the mathematical reality, to see the truth of everything, you need to have a mind. And this distinction, you can see, Parmenides and this poem really sort of putting it on the table and saying, well, you need to take this seriously. That there are two ways of understanding the world. One way is the true way, the mathematical way, the logical way, the way in which things are mathematical objects and perfectly definable, way in which you can observe these with your mind and you can get a complete picture, a complete truth of things. And then you have the way of appearances, of opinions, of beliefs, of seeming, the physical world that you observe, which is never precisely defined, because as Heraclitus says, you cannot step into the same river twice, or as Cratylus says, you cannot step into it even once. It's provisional world, it's changeable world. And you can see this distinction really playing on Plato. And we mentioned Plato in the beginning, and we've been mentioning him throughout, but for him it became like a very big deal. The challenge of Heraclitus for Plato needed to be answered with Parmenides, and so the whole theory of forms really comes from there. And then the influence on Aristotle, who again then talks about potentiality and actuality and matter and form, so again you have this sort of like the same tension playing in Aristotle, even though Aristotle is not as stark in that sense as Plato, but you still have it there. And then you can see it through the history of philosophy. You'll see it later with Descartes. You'll see it, you'll see it with Kant as well. So you'll see this through the history of philosophy, this distinction, and which is why I called Parmenides the dynamite, right? He's a dynamite out here. So what is so central here is this distinction between reality and appearance, this gulf between the intellectual world of reality and the physical world of phenomena, of appearances, of what appears. And so in that sense, while Parmenides in his time is being anti-Milesian, anti-Xenophanes, anti-Pythagoras, anti-Heraclitus, but he is also the central influence on the rest of philosophy. In fact, it is to answer him that the next ones that we will cover, next we'll talk of Zeno and his defense of Parmenides, which I think will be fun for you. And then after that, we will talk about the pluralists. We'll talk about Empedocles and Anaxagoras. And then we'll talk about the atomists. And then we will not go much further unless we have some time. Then we might cover a bit of the future influences of the pre-Socratics. But I would say that footnote on Plato, yes, but footnote on Parmenides really, and on Heraclitus as well, I suppose. So that's where the footnote it begins here. Parmenides is the dynamite of I would say the history of Western philosophy that sets it off really. So yeah, thanks, and I'll see you next week to talk about Zeno. Thank you.